You hear the term fascism frequently in political discourse, but what does it really mean? How to Talk to Your Son About Fascism is a practical guide for parents and others with young men in their lives who may be vulnerable to recruitment. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Craig Johnson is an independent journalist and academic who studies fascism. He also hosts the podcast 15 Minutes of Fascism. Craig, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to talk.
Well, fascism is one of those terms that gets thrown out a lot in political discourse and often incorrectly. So let's start with the basics. What is fascism?
That's a very good place to start. Fascism is a political movement. It's a right-wing revolutionary political movement, and its goal is to remake the world. The main difference between fascists and mainstream conservatives is this revolutionary aspect that I was talking about. But also, fascists don't just use violence because they think it might be useful sometimes. Fascists believe that violence is good. They think that it is good to be violent, and they think that it's good for people to experience violence. And that's the main thing that makes fascism more dangerous than almost any other political movement in the world.
Well, before we talk about how fascism shows up in today's world, give us a little bit of history. How did this movement get started?
Fascism, well, there's debates about this. Some people would say that fascism begins with the first Ku Klux Klan immediately after the United States Civil War. I would say, and most scholars agree, that fascism begins immediately after World War I. It was founded by Benito Mussolini, the person who would end up leading fascist Italy. And it was founded as a movement of young, disaffected, scared World War I veterans. In fact, before Mussolini landed on the word fascism to describe his movement, he originally was going to call it trenchocracy, as in a movement supporting rule by people who had experienced the trenches. That's why violence is so baked into fascism. It's a movement about violence, about people who've experienced violence and who want to bring that violence into the regular world.
So let's talk a little bit more about the conditions that birthed this movement. One of the things you mentioned is that there was people who were frightened, who were scared. So what were the conditions that existed then? And then how do we contrast that with what's happening today?
Yeah, so immediately after World War I, there were a lot of problems in a whole bunch of countries, even the ones that won. So Italy was on the winning side of World War I, but that didn't mean that the war didn't produce like massive amounts of human suffering, economic problems. Millions of people had died. And so after the war, there was a big movement on the part of veterans especially, but also anybody who was connected to the war effort to try to take that memory of the sacrifices that they had made in order to bring it into the future, to make that the center of their political world. This was especially potent in Germany, where in addition, after the war, there was a massive economic downturn. This wasn't just because of the Great Depression, it was also partly a result of Germany's treaty with the Allies after World War I. But what we're seeing today, the sort of similar features, like obviously the United States, Western Europe, the other places that fascism is growing, they haven't seen a major loss from a military conflict. But we're seeing the same kinds of problems where there's been major economic downturns, and people look into their futures and see that they think that they're going to be worse than their parents' lives were, worse than their grandparents' lives were. That downward mobility, especially among young men, is one of the main reasons, one of the main factors that makes fascism potent today in the same way that it was back in the 20s and 30s.
Well, you point out in the book that, this is geared toward having a discussion with your son about fascism. And one of the things you point out is that it's not like they hear about fascism and suddenly, yes, I'm on board. It's more of a gradual process that they're kind of seduced into this way of thinking. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, a good way to think about this is the myth of the Trojan horse, right? It's very unlikely that your kid will see a message that actually has a swastika on it and that he'll be like, aha, wait, I'm just going to be a Nazi now. That's not how it works. Instead, what happens is something more like this. Maybe your kid sees a meme or a joke or listens to a podcast that has some content in it that's, a little bit transgressive. Maybe not entirely beyond the pale, maybe not worse than like a South Park or something like that, maybe a Simpsons. It's got an anti-Semitic joke. Your kid laughs at the anti-Semitic joke. He shares it with his friends. Or maybe the computer says like, oh, okay, well, you liked this content. Let me show you something a little bit worse, a little bit more extreme, a little bit more heinous. You follow that rabbit hole down far enough and you end up in actual fascist content. And that's on purpose. The fascists have arranged this media landscape in order to enable them to take up that kind of space publicly, and especially online.
So it sounds like what's happening, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like kind of the problem with social media in general in terms of, finding yourself in a bubble. And you may think, oh, here are other people that think that, so this sort of normalizes it for them and gradually get into more and more questionable territory, but it's also being normalized at the same time. So you think that this is acceptable, but it's really not.
The social bubble aspect of it is very real here. One of the main things that fascism provides for young men today is community. It provides a sense of community. This is for young men who are typically relatively isolated. So we're talking about people who live isolated lives in the suburbs. If you're a 12-year-old kid in the suburbs, like, what can you do? Where can you go? You end up socializing online. You end up on your computer. You end up on Discord. You end up on, video game chats. And this is a good way for fascists to recruit people. It's something that they've been doing for quite some time, and it's been very successful.
Why young men in particular?
So what I like to say is that fascism appeals to young men in both possible senses of the word. Fascism, by its nature, is appealing to young men because fascism is an ideology that's about violence and power and belief and will, and it's about truth. It's not about fact, Fascism as an ideology, as a belief system, is sort of steeped in all of these vim and vigor type feelings. That's very appealing to adolescents, and especially adolescent young men who in our society are encouraged to act out, to be like big and powerful and take up space. Fascism is really appealing in that sense. The other way is that fascism appeals to young men on purpose. Fascists go after young men for recruitment efforts, and they've been doing this for a long time. This is because fascists need young men to be cannon fodder, basically. They need young men to do the dirty work. So, you don't see the 40-year-olds, the 50-year-olds who are running these political movements. You don't see them out on the streets, out in the trenches that much. Instead, they need young guys to go out and meet protesters. They need young guys to take the risks.
At what age should parents start engaging with their young men to have these conversations about fascism and the danger of sort of getting sucked into this ideology?
What I usually say is, so the book was written with kids 10 to 25 in mind. And that's partly because that's when people are the most susceptible to these things, but that's also partly because of brain chemistry. 10 is about when adolescence begins. It's about when puberty begins. And 25 is about when your brain stops fully developing. That's one of the other things that fascism uses to appeal to young men, is the fact that young people's brains are just worse at evaluating risk, especially long-term risk and long-term patterns, than older people are. And that makes it easier to recruit them to fascist efforts. However, if you're asking about, how young is too young, my real answer is that as soon as a kid is choosing their own media consumption, as soon as they're clicking their own YouTube videos, that's when you need to start talking to them about this content, because that's when they'll start seeing it.
One of the things you point out in the book, it's not a successful strategy for parents to just say, well, I'm going to try to make it so they'll never see this, or I'm just going to kind of ignore it. But you say we actually need to engage it. So tell us about how do we do that?
Yeah, the big comparison here is like, you're not going to be able to shelter your child from sexual content on the internet. That's impossible. You're not going to be able to shelter your child from people who are doing drugs. That's impossible. You need to get out ahead of it, right? You need to talk to them about it. You need to present yourself as a trustable confidant. Tell me if you see something. Tell me if something happens and you're curious about it or concerned or feel unsafe, right? That's what you need to do. You need to do exactly the same thing with this kind of content. And a lot of what's confusing for people, especially parents now, is that they didn't grow up with any of this content. This is entirely new. Unlike conversations about sexual health or conversations about drugs, or conversations about racism or something like that. This is something new. And so parents are unprepared for the idea that this is something that they might need to talk about. But the solutions, the postures are the same. You need to present yourself as somebody the kid can trust, somebody who isn't going to yell at them when they make a mistake, somebody who isn't going to cut them off immediately when they do something that you disagree with. Instead, somebody who can be loving and caring.
So let's say you're a parent and you're doing your best to try to do what's right for your child. What should we be looking for? What are the warning signs that your son might be starting to adopt this ideology?
Well, the warning signs are very similar to other major behavioral changes. So the warning signs include things like massive transformation in friend groups. So if your kid suddenly has a bunch of different friends and they talk differently and their jokes are different. Another potential warning sign is spending a whole bunch of time online, but not just online, but like in sort of like video game forums or Discord servers. If your kid doesn't want to talk to you about what he thinks is funny, or your kid doesn't want to share with you any of the jokes that he finds funny, if your kid refuses to explain them or refuses to talk about it, those are major warning signs. Things that if your kid gets into them, you should be paying attention because these are major on-ramps, like one of these Trojan horses, right? These include fitness influencing and dating advice influencing. Those are things that fascists have used for, at this point, generations in order to get more young men on their side. So things like fitness influencing, things like dating advice influencing, also like rich lifestyle influencing. So like, cars, mansions, etc. If those are the kinds of celebrities that your kid is following, people who are famous simply because they're rich, that's something to be concerned about.
So I'm wondering, it seems like there have to be different strategies, and obviously it varies child to child, but there's one thing to sort of get ahead of this, like you said, and have those conversations which hopefully will prevent them from being seduced by fascist ideology. But if you see your kid is already headed there or showing signs, then what do you do? How do you react to that as a parent to try to get him away from that?
Yeah. If your prevention isn't working, if instead you see that your kid has gotten interested in this stuff, then it's time to get serious. And again, you're using the same strategies, the same ideas that you might use if you found out that your kid had a drug problem. Your first step is not to cut them off completely, right? Instead, your first step is to say, I'm worried about you. I'm concerned about what's happening. This is scary for me. I don't want this to be your life. And so you have to come out and say, like, this is unacceptable. I can't live with this, I have to set my boundaries. But when you're willing and ready to make amends, when you're ready to apologize, move out of this community, realize the mistakes that you've made, I'll be here. I still love you. And everybody's going to have their own different boundaries, and it'll depend on their own mental state. It'll depend on their safety. It'll depend on the safety of the other people in their community. But yeah, those are the tools that we need.
I want to shift gears for just a moment. And another term people hear a lot is Antifa. So tell us a bit about Antifa and whether it really deserves the bad press it gets all the time.
Well, the short answer is no. Antifa is a diffuse network of people who oppose the rise of fascism. I like to say that if you don't like fascism, then you are an anti-fascist, definitionally. Antifa as an organization and as a political movement, its purpose is to prevent fascism from being able to take up public space. Sometimes they use relatively serious protest methods in order to do this. They protest illegally, without a permit, and sometimes they destroy public property or private property. That might not be a really great thing to do, but it does work. And preventing fascism is, I would say, the most important thing that a person could be doing politically right now. So I support those efforts personally. I like to say that if you read this book, then and you don't want your kid to be a fascist, then you're Antifa too.
Mm-hmm. I think the problem people have with it when they see the violence, Because you're protesting against violence and you're using violence to do that. So, how does that make you better?
That's one of the complicated things. And for this, I want to go back to something that I said earlier, which is that fascists don't just use violence. They believe in violence. They think that violence is good. They are going to be violent. Full stop. They show up and they bring violence. When people respond with defending themselves in their communities, we have to understand that that's something that they've learned from, at this point, a century of fighting with fascists. Now, I don't support public violence. I don't support partisan violence at all. But the fact is that fascists bring violence.
What can we do, short of being violent, if, that's not something you want to engage in? What can we do to fight against fascism?
Yeah, the good news is that you don't need to be violent in order to fight fascism. In fact, that may or may not be the best thing to do at all. There are all sorts of strategies and things that you can do. Show up to protests in a peaceful way. That's an excellent way to stop fascism. And by that, I don't mean, passively. You should yell at them and scream at them. Absolutely. You should get in their way. You should block their path. If you're not interested in doing that, which, not everybody is, another thing that you can do that's very important is show up and vote for anti-fascist politicians. You can make sure that your community isn't one that is welcoming to fascism. Any community where you are a leader or a person that people look to, especially young people. So this could be your own family. This could be your cul-de-sac. This could be your block. This could be a classroom. This could be a faith community you're a part of. It could be a sports team that you coach. Any of these things. If you hear about any of this kind of fascist messaging percolating around those kids, that's your job. It is your job to go out and say, like, hey, that's unacceptable, or I don't understand what's funny about that, or let's check in about this. That's a big thing that you can do to help. The other thing, of course, is that you can donate to anti-fascist organizations such as the ACLU or the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Well, before I let you go, I know that you host a podcast. Tell us about it and how people can find it.
Thanks. So I host a weekly podcast. It's called 15 Minutes of Fascism. It does exactly what it says on the tin. It is a 15-minute news brief about fascist news around the world. It also concludes by celebrating the death date, so the death birthday of one fascist in history. You can find it wherever good podcasts are sold. It's hosted on SoundCloud, but it's on Spotify, it's on Apple Music, it's on all of them.
Well, there's much more in this book we didn't have a chance to talk about. So what would you say are a few of the key concepts you hope readers will take from it?
I would say that the biggest thing that I want people to take away from reading this book is that fascism is very prepared to be confronted with violence and vitriol and anger. And that might be the way to fight fascism in public. If you encounter a fascist in the street, you need to show up angry. You need to show up vitriolic. You need to show up ready for the confrontation that they are going to bring. But when you're fighting fascism in the private world, at home, at church or another faith community, at school, that's not going to work. Yelling at a young man is not going to bring him out of fascism. It's only going to push him further in. Instead, you need to show up with a weapon that they are unprepared for, one that is uncomfortable to wield in the face of fascism. You need to show up with love and empathy. You need to understand that this young person is also a victim of fascism. He's been recruited. He's been duped. And if you can help take him out of that before he becomes a true believer, then you will have done him one of the greatest favors of his entire life.
To learn more, the book is How to Talk to Your Son About Fascism. It's by Craig Johnson. Craig, thank you for talking with me today.
Absolutely. Lovely conversation.
If you would like to purchase How to Talk to Your Son About Fascism, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you appreciate this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.